Hi, let's talk about budgeting. Let's talk about what you need to know to create an effective budget for the RFP exercise. So, first of all, I want to step back and talk a few things. One is, in the overall score, the budget's only worth 5 points, so it's not that big of an impact. But having said that, one of the first things the CAC members do is they do look over the document and look at the price. It's going to be in your executive summary. They're going to want to know how much it costs. So it does, in some ways, overshadow your document. And the last thing I want to point out before we get started is no one really knows the right budget. So that's a good thing. No one really knows what the right budget should be. Different companies have different ways of figuring out budgets. So there's not a magical budget number. It's feasibility. What budget seems most feasible? What's the value for the dollars that the organization is spending? Those things go into the budget. So let's step back even more and talk about a little bit why respond to a request for proposal. Well, one is to get business. That's the way in the e-learning industry a lot of business is done. A company will put out a request for proposal. You'll respond to the request for proposal. Second is to complete business. The RFP and then you write the proposal in response to it actually is a document that you'll write that will explain what you're going to do and how you're going to complete the project. Now, once you write the proposal and it's accepted, there's a thing called a statement of work, sometimes a SOW, S-O-W, that explains in a little bit more detail, but the proposal is almost always the launching point. And then finally, to get repeat business, right? You put out proposals, you write proposals because you want repeat business from companies. You want to do a good job on your proposal so that you get the project, do a good job on the project so you'll get more opportunities. The ideal situation is you don't get an RFP, you just get the work. So that's kind of how the overall project works. Let's look at the components of the proposal really quick. You have a solution, you have the price and budget, and you have the schedule. So here we're going to really hone in on the price and budget. That's what this particular exercise is about, this particular lesson is about. And of course, you want your qualifications of your company as well. But let's talk about pricing and budget. So basically, your budget is the total sum of money that's allocated to a particular purpose or a time period. So in this particular case, of course, the allocation is toward developing the e-learning project or product that's being requested by the client. So what goes into a budget? Well, you've got labor, and in the e-learning industry, labor is a huge part of the expense. It takes several people to create a module, so you're going to have to account for all of those folks, but you're also going to have overhead, which is another really expensive item. And this is something a lot of people that go freelance kind of forget about, right? There's this overhead. You've got to pay for the software, you got to pay for your computer, you got to pay for insurance, you got to pay for heating, lighting, all kinds of things. So overhead is a big part of it. And then finally, let's not forget profit. We want to remain profitable. Clients actually want us to be profitable, just not too profitable, right? If we're profitable, we stay in business. We're going to be around for a while. We're going to get to do lots of projects. If we're not profitable, we may fold in the middle of the project. We might not be around. We might not be able to update things. So clients want us to be profitable, just not too profitable. But labor, overhead, and profit are what make up our budget that we want to give. And of course, there's software costs in there as well, but mostly these are the three biggies. So when we have a project bid price, it's basically the total estimated expenditure of everything, right? Personnel time, any materials that we might have, the overhead, the profit. All this becomes the bid price for our e-learning project. This is what we're going to bid on. And that's going to be the price. So the cost is what it costs us as an organization. The profit is what we make, and the price is what we charge to the client or the customer. So there are different types of projects that it bears thinking about. So one is time and materials. That's for X number of time and forever what materials you use, you charge me as the client. Now, as the client, I don't like time and materials that much because I might not know if there's a ceiling. This might run on forever. This might be really kind of more than I wanted to think about. So time and materials isn't always the favorite of a client. It's great for me as a freelance designer, not so much as a client. So what a client might do is do a fixed fee. So that basically says, whatever it takes, you give me an estimate, and then that's what I'm going to pay. And if it takes you more quickly than that fixed fee, good. If it takes you longer than that, well, that's good too, but I'm only going to pay what we agreed on for the fixed fee. So that means no matter what, this is what it costs. Really tough to do because we've got to estimate it, we got to figure it out. There's so many things that go into figuring out the price of e-learning, but fixed fee is how it's done primarily in the field. Fixed fee is a way that a lot of fees are scheduled. So a mixture of the two, time and materials and fixed fee, is a not to exceed. So you might say, look, we're going to, you can't go over, $40,000, but you could work up to that, and whatever time it takes you to get $40,000, that's great. Hope you come in below that. So that's the not to exceed. Again, the most frequent one you're going to see is fixed fee, and that's the one we're doing for this particular exercise. Okay, so let's talk about budgeting. So what do we need to know about budgeting? Well, budget is built on the scope of the project. So we got to figure out how big is this project so that we know what the right scope is. So we might want to look at maybe the number of objectives, learning objectives that we want. Maybe we're going to look at the types of interactions and the level of interactions. We might look at assessment requirements. We might have a lot of requirements for assessment. We may have requirements for the expected length of the program. Programs are getting smaller and smaller. A smaller program doesn't necessarily mean less price to develop, because sometimes it takes a lot of effort to develop a really concentrated, powerful piece, but that can be part of it. And then also level of media integration, how much media are we going to have? We're going to use 360 video, we're going to have virtual reality, we're going to have augmented reality. Like, what are we doing in terms of all of that kind of information? And then finally, what's the technical challenge? Are we integrating with single sign-on? Are we just popping it into an LMS that already exists? Are we creating a gamified platform? Are we leveraging a gamified platform that you already have? Lots of different budgeting considerations that go in there. Lots of different ways to think about your scope. Different organizations typically have different ways of thinking about and designing scope, but here are some things that organizations consider. And finally, number and type of deliverables. So, for example, you might have a project that's very heavy on the design side. So you might go through a whole process of creating a design document and vetting the design document. I work for a company they call it a smart start document, like let's get everything together, or a concept document, or storyboards. They might be a deliverable as well. A task analysis might be a deliverable. So lots of different elements go into figuring out how big this thing is. And the whole reason for this is to eliminate the risk the vendor takes on. So you want to make sure that the budget is as close to what you actually think it's going to be, with a little bit of contingency, so that when things go awry, and things often do, that you'll be able to cover those particular costs. So why is it important to estimate accurately? You kind of already talked about it. You have to cover your costs. You don't want budget overruns, and you've got to make a profit. If you spend too much time not making a profit, eventually you're going to go out of business. If you're just covering costs, when you hit the downside, and the e-learning business is very boom or bust, although right now it's very boom. So you run into these issues. So you want to make a profit. So how do we actually go about this? Well, I talk about often, not always, a work breakdown structure process. So what we want to do is create a list of all the major phases or parts of your project. So what are they? Well, maybe I need to do analysis, or maybe I'm just doing development, or maybe I have to do a big assessment, or whatever they happen to be. You want to list those out. And then you want to break down those major phases into smaller tasks and deliverables. So if I'm going to do an analysis, for example, I'm probably going to maybe I'm doing an audience analysis. So if I am, one of the things I might want to do is create a survey. So one of the things I have to do is actually write the questions for the survey. Then I have to put them in the survey software. Then I have to write emails. Then I have to send those emails out. Then I have to collect the data. Then I have to analyze that data. Then I have to write that data up in a report. So all of those are an example of how I would do a little bit of an audience analysis. I would break that down into small tasks, and maybe I'd charge the client for creation of the survey. Maybe I'd charge a client for the process of analyzing the survey. Maybe I'd charge the client for the survey report, right? All of those are billable to the client because it's taking my time, my company's time, to do that analysis. So you wouldn't charge them for each individual question, although I guess you could, but that would be quite the small breakdown. So basically what you do is, creating, a survey for audience analysis. Boom, you're done. Now, if you're doing, for example, personas, because maybe you're doing design thinking, then you would charge them for the persona, right? The data collection on the persona, the creation of the life and times of that person, validating the persona. So whatever it happens to be, those are the phases that you would have. Then what you're going to do is you're going to assign a time and price to each deliverable. So you think, well, how long is it going to take me to actually develop this survey? I've got some questions from before, so maybe I can pull those together, but not all of them. So maybe, I don't know, maybe 20 hours, right? So you say, okay, this is 20 hours. Now, in our company, how much is 20 hours worth? So in some companies, my time, 20 hours, as maybe a new instructional designer, might be worth less than somebody who's a more experienced instructional designer. So maybe I'm $50 an hour, and maybe somebody else is $100 an hour. They're the senior instructional designer. So some companies will charge, okay, I'm going to put a junior person on that. That's $50 an hour. It's 10 hours. That's $500. Some will say a senior can do it for 2 hours or $100 an hour. That's $200. But many companies just use what they call a blended rate. So they just average together. Okay, so I've got a senior instructional designer. I have a junior instructional designer. One's $100 an hour, one's $50, so the average is $75 an hour. So our blended rate is $75 an hour. Then I multiply that by the number of hours it's going to take to do that, and then I add it all together. I add in any external expenses. Maybe I have a translator, or maybe I have ongoing software cost, or maybe I'm buying stock art just for this project, and I can charge that to the client. Maybe I can't charge it to the client, depending how you write your contract, and boom, that's your price. Then you write that up and you give it to the client. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. You got to remember the first thing to do is to think of everything you can that's a cost, right? All project personnel. You might have a project manager, senior instructional designer, junior instructional designer. Maybe it's a very complicated software integration. You might get your IT person involved. You've got to think of those kind of things. Travel. Back before COVID, we used to travel places. So maybe you're going to travel to do the kickoff. Maybe you're going to travel to do a pilot, or just the time to interview people with some kind of virtual classroom software. So you have that to consider as well. And you have external, maybe translators, as I said before. If you're going to do it in Mandarin Chinese, you might have to send it out to be translated. So you would send it out to a translator. If grammar and spelling is a huge issue, you may send that out to an external copy reviewer who might do that. If you want special art, you might send it out to an artist. Those kind of things. If you want posters to accompany your online learning, you might have those kind of costs, printing costs. You might have ongoing costs like software as a service. So if you're using maybe one of those explainer video softwares, sometimes if the client wants to be able to update that, it costs X dollars a month. They've got to be able to do that. Or if you've providing them a solution where you're providing microlearning on a platform that you've developed or that somebody else has developed, there might be an ongoing monthly cost. So that needs to come into play as well. And then finally, if you are going to mail something, like I've worked with a company and they mailed out little cards, playing cards that had messages on them. And so that was baked in. That was baked into the cost of, hey, we're going to mail out 1,000 of these to all over the country. So we're going to have to do that. So if you mail swag or something for that, that's important to have that in there. So really, these are things to consider, but there might be many more. The real point here is you've got to consider, like, okay, what would all the costs be? Write them down, brainstorm them, try to think of, well, what are some other costs that I might have? It's really easy to miss a cost, so try to get as many as you can. Then you need to determine an estimate. So let's use an example. So let's say that your company is asked to create a small electronic performance support tool for a process that has, maybe 8 steps. And the user then has to generate, user input generates automatic calculations. So, maybe I'm calculating interest, or maybe I'm calculating the number of hours it's going to take to develop something like that. I want some built-in training to walk me through because it's performance support. And I think it'll take about 30 help screens. I'm not sure, but I think this whole thing will be maybe 30 screens. So, and honestly, when somebody looks at this, they might be an experienced developer and they might have an idea of, what it would take, and maybe it's 30 screens, maybe not, but nobody honestly knows for sure. It's the best estimate. But once I have this kind of information and kind of figured out, okay, I think this is it, then my next step is to actually create the scope of the project. So again, I've got this small electronic performance support tool. It's got 8 steps. The user inputs some stuff. It generates calculations. I need some help. It's about 30 screens. Okay, great. So the overall scope. So it's 8 steps. I know that. So let's write down what we can quantify, right? We know it's 8 steps. We know it's 30 screens, or, we're going to say we know it. We know there's calculations. So write down what you know to be true about the project. This will help you when you scope out the project. So then we say, okay, we've got these things, right? We've got performance support, we've got training, we've got programming. Okay, that's great. So who's got to work on it, right? Who do I need? Well, I'm going to need a designer. They might have to do some analysis. They might have to come up with the training for the training screens. I might need an artist for graphic user interface if I want this to be really, really special. I might not want to use kind of off-the-shelf stuff. I might want to bring in an artist, a graphic artist. I would maybe need to bring in a programmer for the calculations and maybe for the navigation, programmer slash developer. Maybe I don't need a programmer for the navigation, but maybe I need one for the calculation. So I'll just use the same person. She'll do a good job. I might want a QA person, quality assurance, for the testing. And then, of course, I might want some kind of project manager to oversee this entire project. So I want to think through, once I have kind of a scope and the major elements of the project, I want to break them down by who's going to do what. Now, once I have that, I want to think about, okay, so what are the tasks? Well, the designer, I'm going to have the designer create a design document. Okay, I got that. I'm going to have the designer create the flow chart and storyboards. That's going to be a document because I need them to write out the flow charts. I need them to write out the storyboards because I'm going to show them to the client. So I want them to know whether the right look and feel and it makes sense and it flows right. I want the artist to create the graphical user interface. So they're going to create that interface and I'm going to show it to the client. Maybe I'll do a couple versions of it to let the client choose their right version. Then I want the programmer to author using, any of the latest and greatest authoring software that's available. QA person, they're going to go through a testing process. I'm going to give them a testing protocol. I might have them write the testing protocol. That might be a document that I can actually charge the client for creating a testing protocol and for their time testing. And then the programmer might package it. So maybe a beta version, maybe finally gold version or whatever. It may be as simple as publishing it to Scorum, or it may be more complicated depending on the LMS. And again, all systems say they're scoring compliant, all LMSs are scoring compliant, and for the most part they are, but sometimes there's these little, this isn't working in the player, but it's working, independently. Oh, it's not working in the LMS, but it's working in the mobile version. So you always have these issues sometimes that come in, so you want a little extra time for that. And then of course, I want the project manager to oversee the entire project. And sometimes that's buried in the overall rate, but more and more I'm seeing that as a separate line item of this is how many hours the project manager is going to spend overseeing the project, which is good. So here's a really simple example, right? We want time to create, the document or the storyboard or the interface times the rate per hour, any associated materials that might be enveloped. Again, there's not a whole lot usually instructional design, but if you're preparing instructor-led training, you might have workbooks and you might have facilitator guides and binders. But here, let's just for e-learning's sake, so we say, well, it's going to take us 60 hours and our rate per hour is $50 per hour plus no material. So this will cost $3,000. So actually the math, once you figure out how many hours it is actually quite simple. You just take the number of hours times the price per hour and come up with a number. Now, where do you get like how many hours it's going to take? That's a little trickier. And where do you get the $50 per hour? That's a little trickier still. I think actually coming up with the 60 hours, like how long is it going to take me actually to create that document, is a little bit trickier than even coming up with how many hours. But let's take a look at where that $50 comes from. Where did you get that $50? Let's take a look. So there's several ways to figure this out. So one way is to say, okay, here's the employee's salary, $41,600 a year. Our company overhead is 80%, and we want to make a 40% profit, which is awesome. Let's try to make 40%. So here we take the employee's salary, $41,600 a year, and we divide that by 2,080 hours a year. Why 2,080 hours a year? Because that's the average amount of hours an employee works per year. Maybe you get 2 weeks off for vacation, and then you get federal holidays. So it works out to about 2,080 hours a year. If we divide 41,600 by 2,080 hours a year, we get $20. So when we look at the employee rate, we can see there's the $20. Now our company overhead is 80%. We're going to talk about overhead in a moment. So that's 0.8, 1.8, and then we want to make a profit of 40%. So we multiply all that together and we get our $50.40. Now, in the previous example, we rounded that down to $50 an hour. Probably not a good thing to do. I would round that up probably to $55 an hour or something like that. The point is not that it's $55. The point is that I would round up, because if you're not rounding up, you're literally losing 40 cents on every hour that you work. And you say, well, that's not much, on 1 hour, but you might make that up in volume, right? You don't want to lose money in any way, shape, or form. You say, hey, we're just eating into the profit margin. Well, that's not a good thing either. So I would probably round that up. So this is one way to do it. Figure out the salary, divide by the number of hours in a year, take your overhead, take your desired profit, come up with your hourly rate. So so before we go too far, let's talk a little bit about what is the overhead. So overhead is everything that's not directly billable to a client. So you've got professional fees, right? You probably have an accountant that you have to pay for. You have a legal person that you have to pay for. So those are two big professional fees. You may have other consulting fees that come in there as well. So professional fees. Then you have advertising. If you're a freelancer or if you're a company, people have to know about your services. Somehow you have to let people know. That's advertising. That's overhead. You might have insurance. As an independent consultant, I've got liability insurance, right? As a company, I've got insurances that I have to pay for. I might have flood insurance on my business. I might have loss of business insurance. So all kinds of insurance. interest on a loan. If you're a large company, maybe you took some loans out in tougher times, or maybe you took a loan out for the building, or maybe you took a loan out for whatever it happens to be. You need to account for that. You need to account for rent, utilities, internet, telephone, right? All the things that you're going to need to conduct business. You need repairs and maintenance. Things wear down over time. You might need office supplies if you're in an office. You've got to pay taxes. All of this has to go into your overhead rate. So your overhead rate might be 80%, might be 90%, might be 100%, might be even higher. Now, lots of times, if you're an e-learning developer working for a large e-learning company, they'll just give you the rate, right? Or the finance people will figure it out and they'll give you a number. You won't have to worry about it. But if you're a freelancer, you're going to have to worry about these kinds of things. Another thing that goes into overhead is what's called the labor burden. And that means it's not the salary you pay your employees, but it's everything associated with it, right? You have payroll taxes on salary. You've got pension costs if you're paying pension or 401k or anything like that. You might have health insurance, dental insurance, any other benefits. You might get, Friday, everybody gets, a six-pack of beer or something like that in the company. That's great, but that's part of the labor burden. So that has to come into account. And then you've got, rent, supplies, all this travel, all that kind of stuff. So that goes into that 80% overhead, and it may be higher. At different companies, overhead's different, and there's variable overhead and fixed overhead. I'm not going into any of that. Just know that overhead goes into the hourly rate that you have to figure out. So let's look at another way of figuring it out. So what happens here is we still have the 41,600. Company's overhead is still 80%, but now we have this thing that's 3.5. What is that? And the rate then is $70 per hour. What is this 3.5? Well, basically, it's a multiplier. It's a factor. So some larger e-learning companies, actually, and some small ones as well, have their accounting department has worked out this factor that they multiply by everybody's salary, and that's how they come up with the rate. So they figured out, oh, you're 20 and you're 30, but if I look at all the overhead, the fixed, the variable, the profit we want to make, if we just multiply everything by 3.5, we're good. So that's another way of figuring out rates. You just kind of take the hourly rate of a person, multiply it by this factor, again, usually given to you by the finance or accounting department, and now you have your hourly rate. And in this case, it works out pretty nicely for the profit of the company, 94.4%. So that's another way that it can be worked out. Now, here's another way. This is kind of the, I guess, most fun way, but most non-systematic way. If you have proposals float around, and whether you like it or not, other companies know what your rate is, and they know what you're charging, and they have a good idea what this company charges over that company. And if you know your competitor is at $76 an hour, maybe you come in at $75 an hour, and if it's only based on price, you might win and you might make a lot of profit. So that's just another fun way that sometimes it's done. Sometimes people just swag it. You just pick a number and go with it. So another way to do that is industry averages. And what I want to do here is show you some websites that have some really good information. Now, this is a website that's relatively old, 2010. So that's 10 years old. So the numbers might not hold up in terms of how long it actually takes, but Brian does a really great job of looking at, okay, if he did this survey and he said, okay, if we're going to do instructor-led training, what's it gonna take? So he said, well, on average, back in 2010, it was about $18,000 an hour if we look at it. And how does that, what I think is valuable for us is how does that kind of break down? Well, he broke it down, which was, I think, really, really helpful. So he said, look, that 18,000, if we look at this, we can see that, there's a front-end analysis, that's your needs assessment. Here's how much time was spent on that task. Here's how many hours it kind of took for 1 hour at level 2 of e-learning, etc. Here's the instructional design process. Here's storyboarding, graphics. So the nice thing that Brian did was it gives you a good sense of how long it takes to do different parts of the project and gives you a sense of what are the different parts of the project that are required. So this is worth looking at. He talks here about level 3 e-learning. So level 1 is kind of basic. It's just kind of like PowerPoint. Level 2 is interactive PowerPoint plus maybe try-its or simulations. And level 3 is a full-blown interactive simulation with avatars and award-winning type of stuff. And he says, hey, the low end is 217 hours. The high range is 716 hours for every 1 hour of finished instruction. So take a look at what Brian Chapman did in terms of the numbers. Might not be 100% accurate, 10 years later, but I think it gives you a good sense of the percentages and a good sense of the process of developing it, and will help you make an estimate. Now, another place to look is a colleague, and Robin DeFelice has spoken in this class and given some of her insights and wisdom, but she did an article in 2018 called How Long to Develop 1 Hour of Training. She updated it from past work that she had done and I had done way back and started back in 2003. But this gives you some sense of the numbers. So she said, if you're going to do traditional training, here's how many hours these people did. Here's on average 38. If you're doing level 1, which is relatively passive, that's 42 hours. Okay, so 42 phase 1. Let's go back and look, maybe what Chapman did. How close is that to this? Let's see. There's phase 1, 10,000, but what's the number of hours? Anywhere from, where did that go? 49 hours to 125. And if we look here, we can see, okay, this is 38, so or 42, So it's in the ballpark, but that's a wide range. So these are going to give you some ideas. But the important thing here is read the article, because Robin gives you some really good information about unknown factors that impact the development time and what's going to take longer or shorter. Are you going to have special user interface design things? What about your project manager? What kind of learning is it? Right? Cognitive affective, for example. I think affective might be more difficult to develop, right? So she talks a lot about that, and then she follows up that with an article on how long to develop 1 hour of training. She does a case study of going through the entire process and talking about it. So that can be really helpful. And she talks about different risk factors that are going to impact the budget. And then finally, this organization, the Raccoon Gang, did another update for 2020. So they did this back in June. So, hot off the press. If you're watching this in 2020, if not, it's not as hot off the press. But they're talking about 90 to 240 hours on average that we found. Robin and I found. Then they're talking about Chapman about 10,000, but you got to consider all that information is dated, and they're absolutely right. And the numbers are overall costs. And so what they do very nicely is go down and they break it into team roles, how long they're involved, what their rate might be, what their overall dollars might be, and then they break it down some more. Okay, let's look at who's involved in a design stage. What are the hourly rate? If you get somebody from Upwork or a contractor or an expert, what are they going to charge? And if it's an instructional designer, maybe it's $60 per hour plus. Maybe if you have a graphic designer, it might be $80 plus. And so they do a nice job of breaking it down to give you a sense of how much it might cost as you've broken down the process and assigned these deliverables, which are basically tasks that you're doing, and shows you, some really good information there. So I wanted to show you that, and you can click on those links and look at those. So that's kind of the overall process, but one thing that you want to mitigate in the process is this thing called budget creep. You want to make sure that the budget doesn't get out of hand or out of control. So what is budget creep? Well, basically, the increases the cost of the project without increasing the size of the budget. So basically, the client wants more and more and more. You keep putting it in. It takes more time. It gets more expensive, and all of a sudden, your costs go up and up and up, but you're not getting paid anything more because the budget's kind of stayed where it is. So what causes that? Lots of things, right? If you don't have a well-defined scope or statement of work, you're going to run into trouble. So that's something to consider. Any unexpected revisions, if you don't have sign-offs and somebody comes in with a change and they thought this and you thought that, and all of a sudden, no, we got to make this change, that can be a problem. If you have different expectations, right? Oh, we thought when you meant interactive, it was multiple choice questions. Oh no, when I said interactive, I meant virtual reality. Everybody knows interactive means virtual reality, not multiple choice questions, right? Well, everybody might not know that. So if you don't spell that out in your statement of work or your proposal, you're going to definitely have divergent expectations and nobody's going to be happy. You also have indecisions, right? The client's not sure what's going on, or the client, I've worked several cases where the product on which we are developing training is under development itself. And that makes for an interesting process, right? That was in software development. So literally, we were supposed to get the software on that Monday and have the training together by Friday. Crazy, right? Every week. So you can definitely have those indecisions and things like that. And then you make an error. You're a vendor. You make a mistake, right? Who has not done that? Most of the time, though, if it's a mistake on the part of the vendor has to eat that mistake. So you don't want to make mistakes, and usually that doesn't impact the client. So how do you prevent budget creep? Well, one is that you detail your assumptions in the proposal. So you say, look, we're assuming that you're using version X of this product. Because you could run into backwards compatibility, forward compatibility. So you want to make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of that information. You might want to quantify output as much as possible, right? We're going to do 30 screens. We're going to do 4 scenarios. We're going to do 3 multiple choice questions per objective. You want to quantify as much as possible so that you don't get out of control. And quantification also helps you to know when your efforts are done. Like, hey, we've done the 3 objectives. This is good. We don't need a 4th. We don't need a 5th. This is what we're going to do. Include risk mitigation strategy. If this happens, we're going to do this. If this happens, we're going to have to do this. We one time we were working for this company, client, and they were a little bit difficult. And we said, look, every day you delay getting us information is a day delay in the deliverable dates. Day for day delay. We had to do that. Really tough client to work with. That was trying to reduce the risk of us as a vendor in this process. And then you want to include everything you can think of, all the costs. We talked about this up front, but all the costs you can think of in the proposal, really important process. Also, you can create greater efficiencies as an e-learning company, right? Templates. You can have processes that work really smoothly. Checklists help. Your goal is to get it created as quickly but as effectively and high quality as possible. You want to prioritize parts of the project. I had an old mentor, and it would always say, do the high value parts first, right? Charge for the analysis. Charge for the design. Don't just charge for a module, because you'll be doing all this analysis and design work up front, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong and you never deliver the module. You're out all that money up front. So charge up front for high prioritized parts of the project. And if there is a problem, most clients are reasonable. Hey, This took a lot longer. I've been working with the client now, and we've had our design sessions took way longer than we had anticipated. And we went back to them and said, hey, we're out of hours. We're out of hours for this project. And we haven't developed anything yet because the design process has been great. We've discovered some awesome things, but wow, it took us a lot longer than we thought. We're going to need some more budget, right? Sometimes you can get away with that. Sometimes the client like, no, why didn't you warn me ahead of time? So that's why almost on a weekly basis, if you're running a project, you want to tell the client where the hours are so that they have a good sense, and you want to keep track of the hours yourself so you can be like, hey, wait a minute, this is skewing in the wrong direction. We only had 10 hours for design, but we've already spent 20 hours. We're double. We've got to do something. So you want to be aware of that. What you do want to do in the budget is include it in the main document of your body as the main body of the document. Jeez. Because as you're reading the proposal, you want to have the budget be an integral part of the proposal. It is an integral part of the proposal, so have it in the document, in the proposal that you're writing. Then what you want to do is determine the base price based on an average salary. It's called the blended rate. We talked about that. Blended rates are so much easier to manage, so much easier for the client to understand, so much easier to not be nitpicked. I've seen, oh, why are you paying your QA person 65 when your artist is only 70? Like, that doesn't make sense for us. Can we get a cheaper QA person? And then you got to. So I find that blended rate tends to work much better. And then work the budget several ways, right? So try to do a work breakdown structure. See what happens if you add a multiplier. See what happens if you use industry averages. Look at different ways and see if the numbers don't come out in a similar range. They're not going to come out exactly the same. And again, there's no magic budget number that somebody has. I mean, somebody might have a budget for a project, but there's so many variables that go into creating online learning that there's not one number that fits all. It's just not. And as I said before, we looked at some external resources. Look at those. Those can give you some insights into what you might want to think about or might want to be doing. So those are the budget do's. We talked a little bit about budgeting a project. So I wish you the best of luck as you sit down, sharpen your pencil, and start to create the budget.